Letter 8. Before I say anything of the management of the plants in your greenhouse, I must remind you that, in order to grow plants well, it is not enough merely to preserve them from the frost, but we must imitate as well as we can their native climate, that is, the degree of heat, light, and moisture they have been accustomed to in their native country, together with the air and the soil. The latter is the easiest condition to fulfill, as, by combining different kinds of earth, we can, without much difficulty, produce a very tolerable imitation of any soil we please. But it is not so easy to give plants abundance of light and air, in combination with heat, and, though we can readily give plants plenty of water, it requires some management to surround them with a moist warm atmosphere, like that they have been used to in their native woods. To meet these difficulties, buildings have been constructed, suited for the reception of plants, with various contrivances for producing heat and distributing air and moisture, and with a glass roof, front, and sides to admit abundance of light. These structures are what we call plant houses, and they are not only divided into hothouses for tender plants and greenhouses for half-hardy plants, but subdivided into various kinds to suit the various climates in which plants are found. These climates, however, are not so numerous as might at first be supposed, as it is a curious fact in the history of plants that many of the most ornamental grow in patches in some parts of the world without being found anywhere else. As, for example, the pelargoniums or shrubby geraniums at the Cape of Good Hope. Even when the same plant is found in different parts of the world, it is generally in the same climate, though in different countries, and thus pines and firs, oaks and birches, spread like belts or zones round the globe, from Asia, through Europe, to America, almost in the same degree of latitude, making an allowance for islands being warmer than continents, and mountains colder than valleys. As you must always remember, that knowing the degree of latitude from which a plant comes is not sufficient to teach its culture, unless we know also whether it grows on the mountains or in the valleys, and whether the climate of the locality is moist or dry. A plant will be soon killed by a dry atmosphere if it requires a moist one, and it will be as much injured by being kept too hot as too cold. Firs and heath will not grow within the tropics, and the first camellias introduced into England were killed by being kept in a hothouse. From what I have said, you will perceive that as plants will only thrive in climates suitable to them, it is not enough to have a hothouse for tropical plants and a greenhouse for those of moderately warm countries, but that you must have 3 or 4 houses imitating different climates if you wish to grow different kinds of plants to perfection. Philosophers who have written on the subject describe 16 distinct kinds of climate, including our own. But, as these would be too many to imitate, gardeners are obliged to content themselves with the following kinds of plant houses and pits. The dry stove is generally kept at a heat of from 70 degrees to 84 degrees in the clay, and never allowed to fall below 65 degrees at night, even in winter. It should be placed in a situation sheltered from cold winds, but quite open to the sun, as the plants grown in it require a strong light, most of them being natives of dry sandy plains, on which there is no tree high enough to east a shade. The plants are grown in pots, which are generally placed on a frame or stage of wooden or stone shelves, so as to have abundance of air round them, and the stove is best heated by flues. The plants suitable for a stove of this kind are some of the kinds of cactaceae, such as the genera Melocactus, Epiphyllum, and Cereus, with the tender kinds of Euphorbium, Mesembryanthemum, Stapelia, Crassula, Sedum, Sempervivum, and Agave, and some kinds of bulbs. The bark stove has a brick pit filled with tan, or dead leaves in the center, and it is generally heated with pipes of hot water, or steam, from 60 degrees at night to 80 degrees in the day. The pots in which the plants are grown, being either plunged in the tan, or placed on the walls of the pit, or on a stone shelf, near the glass in front. Sometimes the trees of hot climates are grown in the bark bed, in the center without pots, and sometimes there is no bark pit. But, The space in the center of the house is filled with boxes containing tropical trees. This last kind is frequently called the botanic stove, as it is most common in botanic gardens, and it is best adapted for growing palms and other monocotyledonous plants with large leaves, such as bananas, which require plenty of air and light. The damp stove, or orchideous house, is only suited for orchideous plants and exotic ferns. The heat should be from 70 degrees at night to 90 degrees in the day, or even more, and the house should be heated with hot flues on which water should be thrown twice or 3 times a day, and hot water pipes with open tanks, as all the plants to be grown in this kind of house require excessive heat and constant moisture. As they are also plants that love the shade, the house should have only a subdued light, and though I cannot say that I approve of the colored glass adopted by some cultivators, as it decomposes the rays of light and deprives the plants of a portion of the heat they would otherwise derive from the sun. Yet, I would certainly advise that some of those climbing plants, which will grow in a moist warm climate, should be trained close under the glass to produce shade. Forcing houses for grapes and early stone fruits are of the nature of the bark stove, and in them the pit in the center is frequently filled with pineapple plants in pots plunged up to the rim in the tan, but these houses belong to the kitchen garden, as do pits for growing pines, cucumbers, and melons. You will thus observe that there are only 3 distinct kinds of hothouses in use in British gardens, viz. The damp stove, or orchidean's house, which is the hottest, the dry stove, or house for succulent plants, which is the rarest, and the bark stove, which is the most common, and which may be said to have 2 varieties, viz. the botanic stove and the forcing house. The culture of hothouse plants in the hark stove requires more care than can be expected from anyone not a regular gardener, and, as most tropical plants are valuable in this country, I would not advise you to try to manage them yourself, as you would be very much vexed if you should chance to kill them. I will, however, give you a few general hints on the subject, which you can put in practice or not, as you may feel inclined. All bark stove plants require a great deal of water when they are in a growing state, and, as it is necessary that the water should be of the same temperature as the house, there should be either an open cistern in the house, or a cistern in the shed behind, near the furnace, and communicating with the house by a pipe. The best plan is to have a cistern in the house, as it can be used as an aquarium, and there are many beautiful tropical aquatics, such as the different species of Nymphaea and Nelumbium, which deserve growing for their beauty, while others are interesting for their curiosity, such as the papyrus. In summer, bark stove plants require very little care, except to prevent them from receiving any sudden check, as, if the heat be not kept up regularly, the plants are very liable to stop growing, and, when the heat is renewed, to shoot a second time, and thus, to waste their strength in sickly and imperfect growth. Great care is also required in autumn to increase the fire heat in proportion as the weather grows cold, so as to prevent the plants from receiving any check from the decrease of temperature in the atmospheric air, as tropical plants may be said to have only 2 seasons, viz. Summer and winter, and thus, they should be kept as nearly as possible at the same heat, as long as they are in a growing state, and then have a complete change to a season of rest by never letting the heat rise higher than from 60 degrees to 65 degrees during the dark days of winter. During the winter months, very little air can be admitted on account of the great difference between the air of the atmosphere and that within the house, but in the spring, advantage should be taken of every warm day, even in March and April, to open the sashes for a few inches, for half an hour, or an hour, in the middle of the day, when the sun shines. But, the house should be shut up immediately, if the sun should go in, and the air should become chilled. As the summer advances, air should be admitted freely, and continued till the beginning of September, when it should be gradually reduced, till the cold of winter prevents any being given at all. Most gardeners repot, or shift, as they call it, all their bark stove plants, about the middle or end of April. But, this is too indiscriminate a practice, and, therefore, only those should be repotted that appear to want such an operation. One of the greatest difficulties attending the culture of plants in a bark stove is guarding against the ravages of the immense number of insects that are engendered by the heat, and one of the most troublesome of these is the active little mite, called by gardeners the red spider, a Campstellarius. This little pest breeds in the bark, and when first hatched, it is so small as to be scarcely perceptible, particularly as it is of a pale green, nearly the color of the underside of the leaf, to which it fixes itself, and there spins a web. As it gets older, it becomes of a brownish red, and, having 8 legs, it runs with the greatest rapidity. It is also furnished with a proboscis, with which it sucks the juices of the leaves, which wither and shrivel up, and thus the flowers, and the fruit of the trees, are both spoiled. As neither can attain perfection unless the sap that is to nourish them be first properly matured in the leaves. Tobacco, smoke, and most of the other usual remedies against insects have no effect on the red spider, and, though sprinkling it with very cold water will kill it, it is difficult to apply without injuring the plants. The best remedy is allowing plenty of air to pass through the house, whenever the weather is hot enough to allow the atmospheric air to be admitted with safety. The culture of the plants contained in the dry stove requires considerable care. The cactus family may be arranged in 3 groups. First, the tree cacti, which are included in the genus Cereus, and have long slender stems without a single leaf, sometimes 30 or 40 feet high, and not thicker than a man's arm. These plants grow on the summits of the mountains in Brazil, and only require greenhouse heat in England. Secondly, the Mammillaria and Echinocacti, which grow in the valleys of the temperate parts of South America, and thirdly, the Melocacti, the Epiphyllum, the Opunties, and the Tivian sols, which grow in the tropics, and require a dry stove in England. These plants should be grown in pots well drained with cinders, and they should be kept almost without water from October till March, and then watered profusely when they are about flowering. Some cultivators keep a few of their plants in a bark stove, and plunge the pots in the tan, and they are said to thrive on this treatment, if carefully managed. But, as it requires a great deal of care to prevent them from damping off, the ordinary way is the safest for an inexperienced gardener. Mesembryanthemums, which are also kept in a dry stove, require the same treatment as the cacti. The orchidaceous plants grown in a damp stove are all epiphytes, which, in their natural state, grow either on the branches of trees or on exposed rocks. The former of these are found in their wild state, with their roots hanging down in the air, and growing in dense forests, where shade, moisture, and excessive heat are essential to their existence. Most of these plants, in a state of culture, are grown in the husks of cocoa nuts, half filled with moss, from which the roots hang down, or they are tied with wire to pieces of wood, hung from the rafters. The wood generally preferred for this purpose in England is the Robinia, or false acacia, on account of the roughness of its bark, and the softness of its wood, and moss is generally put between the epiphyte and log, so as to make it quite compact. Some genera of orchideous plants, such as Dendrobium, Epidendrum, and Cattleya, are always grown in pots, which are filled with turfy peat, chopped moss, and lime rubbish. Others, such as Stan-H.P. and Catasetum, should be grown in baskets half filled with moss, or in a curious kind of frame, made of pieces of turf, fastened between 4 upright pegs of wood, as the flowers of these plants come from their roots, and they must be allowed abundance of room to enable them to protrude properly. The baskets, or frames, for the Stan-H.P. and other root-flowering plants, should be from 3 to 6 inches deep, and from 6 to 10 inches wide, and the frames should be filled with strips of turf, 2 or 3 inches wide, piled up on one another, so as to fill the frame, and yet leave a sufficient space between, to admit the passage of the flower stems, which protrude downwards from the root. When orchideous plants are grown in pots, the pots are drained with cinders, and then filled with chopped turf, mixed with lime rubbish, to keep it open. The exotic ferns grown in the same house require no particular care, except that of potting them, so as to ensure perfect drainage, and keeping them frequently syringed overhead. There may be said to be 5 kinds of greenhouse, viz., the Australian house, the common greenhouse, the heath house, the conservatory, and the orangery, to which is sometimes added the camellia house. Though, these plants are generally kept in the conservatory. The Australian house contains all the curious New Holland plants, such as Banksia, Dryandra, Grevillea, Melaleuca, Callistemon, Metrosideros, and various genera belonging to the Leguminosae, together with the Cape plants belonging to the Proteaceae and Compositas. These plants require a considerable degree of heat, and also as much air and light as can be given to any plants which require shelter from the open air. On this account, they are generally grown in curvilinear houses. That is, houses that have glass on all sides, like that in the garden of the London Horticultural Society at Turnham Green. All the plants contained in this house are extremely difficult to grow, and they require the greatest care in watering, so that they may never have too much, and yet never be suffered to become too dry. Houses of this kind are generally heated by pipes of hot water, and kept at a temperature of from 40 degrees to 50 degrees or 60 degrees. There is no pit in the center, and the plants are kept on a stage, formed of wooden shelves. The common greenhouse has a brick wall at the back, with a glass roof, at an angle of about 45 degrees, and upright glass at the front and sides. The plants are grown in pots, placed on a stage, or range of wooden shelves, rising one above another, with a path all round, and a shelf for the plants under the glass in front. All the sashes are made to open, as it is essential that there should be a free circulation of air, and so little fire is necessary. That one fireplace will be sufficient to heat a greenhouse from 30 to 40 feet long, and from 12 to 15 feet wide. The house may be heated either by hot water pipes or by flues. In the latter case, the flue should go round at the front, and return at the back, being about 20 inches high and 12 inches wide. The heat of a greenhouse of this nature need never be more than 50 degrees in the day, and it may be allowed to sink even as low as 35 degrees at night. The object being merely to keep out the frost. The heath house, like the Australian house, requires to be as transparent and as thoroughly ventilated as possible. A heathery, however, is generally a span-roofed house with a walk down the center and shelves for the plants on each side. It is usually heated by hot water, the pipes for conveying, which are placed in the center of the house. The width of the house should be about 10 feet, and the height in the center of the span should never exceed 9, as it is of great importance to have the plants as near the glass as possible. The floor of the house should stand 1 foot above the level of the ground, and, where expense is not an object, the house is sometimes built on arches to ensure perfect dryness. All the windows are made to move in every possible direction so as to admit of a current of air through the house whenever the state of the atmosphere will permit it. The conservatory differs from all the other kinds of greenhouse in the plants growing in the soil, instead of being in pots and placed on shelves. It is also more lofty and architectural than a greenhouse, and generally of much greater extent. It is frequently attached to the house, and so contrived that it can be entered from one of the living rooms. The temperature of the conservatory is generally rather warmer than that of the greenhouse, as it is kept at 60 degrees during the day, and seldom allowed to fall lower than 40 degrees at night. The orangery is a still more architectural-looking building than the conservatory, and it has an opaque roof. It is used only for preserving orange trees and other plants that remain in a dormant state during the winter, and it requires no more heat than is absolutely essential to keep out the frost. The camellia house is generally formed like a common greenhouse, but so contrived as to allow the whole of the sashes to be taken off during the summer. The plants are kept on stone shelves, raised one above another, and there is generally no walk at the back. Of the culture of the plants in the Australian house, I have already spoken, and of those in the greenhouse, I need only detail the management during the winter months, as your greenhouse will, I suppose, be in the reserve ground, and will be only used to preserve those plants during winter, which you have kept in other more conspicuous situations during the summer months. Many persons injure greenhouse plants by keeping them too warm and giving them too little air during winter, and then are surprised that their plants become sickly and remain without flowering. Notwithstanding all the care and expense that have been bestowed upon them. No greenhouse ought to be kept at a greater heat at night than from 35 degrees to 40 degrees, and in the daytime, it should not be allowed to rise above 50 degrees, or at most 52 degrees. When there happens to be sunshine, the fire ought to be lessened, and whenever the air is not frosty, the windows ought to be opened, from 12 till 2, every day. If a greenhouse is kept too warm, it will induce premature vegetation, and the plant will waste its strength, in an attempt to produce flowers and fruit, at a season when nature requires it to be kept in a state of complete repose. Greenhouse plants should be watered generally every morning, but in frosty weather, water need not be given every day, and some plants will not require watering oftener than once a week. This, however, must depend in a great measure on circumstances, and, as a general rule, it may be observed that water may always be given in small quantities when the surface of the earth contained in the pot looks dry. The pots should never be allowed to stand in saucers, as stagnant water is peculiarly injurious in winter. Whenever the earth in the pot looks black and sodden, the plant should be turned out of the pot, and, after the black earth has been carefully shaken from the roots, it should be repotted in fresh soil, an inch or more, in the bottom of the pot, being filled in with small pieces of broken crocks. In February or March, the plants should be looked over, and repotted where necessary. Those that are too tall should be cut in, and cuttings made of their shoots. The young plants raised from cuttings made in autumn should be repotted in larger pots for flowering, and where the plants do not require fresh potting, but have the surface of their mold become green and mossy, the moss should be taken off, and the ground slightly stirred with a flat stick, taking care, however, not to go so deep as to injure the roots. When trouble is not an object, all greenhouse plants are the better for repotting once a year, either in spring or autumn, and when the ball is taken out of the pot for this purpose, it should be carefully examined, and all the decayed parts of the roots should be cut off. Sometimes, when the ball of earth is turned out, nearly half of it will fall off, almost without touching it, and when this is the case, it will generally be found that there is a worm in the pot. Worms do a great deal of mischief to greenhouse plants in cutting through the roots, as their instinct teaches them to make their way through the earth, straight across the pot and back again, and they cannot do this without tearing the roots asunder every time they pass. Another point to be attended to in the management of a greenhouse is keeping the plants as near as possible to the glass, as, unless this be done, the plants will become what gardeners call drawn up, and unnaturally tall and slender, from the efforts they make to reach the light. As I have frequently mentioned repotting, I may as well tell you here the best mode of performing the operation. The pot to which the plant is to be removed should always have been previously washed quite clean and be perfectly dry. Some bits of broken pots, called potsherds, should then be put at the bottom of the pot, the quantity varying from 3 or 4 pieces, so as just to cover the whole, to a mass an inch in depth, depending upon the nature of the plant. If the plant has not been in a pot before, the roots are then placed just above the potsherds, and the earth is filled in, the plant being occasionally shaken, so as to allow the earth to get amongst its roots. The soil in the pot is next consolidated by shaking it, and then lifting it up and setting it down again with a jerk. The soil being rendered firm and neat round the rim of the pot by means of a broad smooth piece of stick, shaped somewhat like a table knife, and called a potting stick. When a plant has been in a pot before, and is repotted or shifted, as it is called, into a pot a size larger, the plant is turned out of its old pot, by putting the hand upon the earth, and turning the pot upside down, or, if the ball of earth does not come out readily, striking the rim of the pot, against the edge of the potting table or shelf. The ball containing the plant will thus drop out, into the left hand, and the potsherds that adhere to the bottom of the ball having been picked off, and any part of the root that appears decayed having been removed, a little mold is put on the drainage in the new pot, and the ball of earth containing the plant, having been placed in the center, the space between it and the pot is filled in, with light rich mold, and made firm with the potting stick. The operation is concluded by shaking the pot, and then taking hold of the rim, with both hands, and striking the bottom of the pot 2 or 3 times, with a jerk against the potting bench. The plant is then watered and set in the shade for the remainder of the day. Heaths are very difficult plants to manage, but a great improvement has taken place in their culture within the last few years. They are grown in what is called heath mold, that is, a mixture of peat and sand, and when this earth is put into the pot, it is mixed with good-sized entire pebbles, some of which are suffered to protrude through the surface of the soil. The roots of heaths are extremely fine and hair-like, and the shelter afforded by the pebbles is so congenial to them that, if one of the stones be taken out, a cluster of fine, white, vigorous roots will be found below it. The plants are always potted high, so as to let the base of the stem be above the level of the rim of the pot, as the plants are very apt to damp off if the collar of the plant be buried in the ground. Heaths should never be suffered to become too dry, and never kept too wet. They require very little heat, and many experienced cultivators never apply fire heat to their heatheries at all, but merely keep out the frost by having wooden shutters to the sashes and covering them with mats. Heaths, when growing rapidly, should be repotted whenever the roots have filled the pot. But they should not be shifted too often, and, when they have attained their full growth, they may be suffered to remain in the same pots 3 or 4 years without injury. As plants in the conservatory are grown in the free soil, they are in a much more natural state than any plants can be in pots, and consequently, they require much less care in their culture. There is usually a walk all round the conservatory, next the glass, and one down the middle, on each side, of which are the beds containing the plants, and under which are placed the hot water pipes that warm the house. The consequence of this arrangement is that the beds on each side the middle walk are so planted as to have their highest shrubs in the center, shelving down to those of lower growth on each side, and hence the center is generally planted with tall camellias, acacias, metrosideros, eucalyptus, etc., while near the walk are placed oleanders, myrtles, fuchsias of different kinds, together with chirosmas, and many of the other, most ornamental New Holland plants, and, up the pillars that support the roof, are trained Kennedias, bignonias, ipomeas, and passion flowers in great variety. Cleanthus puncteus and Polygala oppositifolia ought to find a place in every conservatory, and a plant of Wisteria sinensis may be trained under the rafters, so as to afford shade to the camellias. As, under shelter, the wisteria will flower twice in the year, and its flowers will yield a delightful, though very delicate, fragrance. As it is of the greatest importance to the health of the plants to have the soil in a conservatory well drained, many persons form the beds by excavating pits of the proper size, about 2 feet and a half deep, and put at the bottom a layer of brickbats, stones, and other materials for drainage, about 6 inches thick. On this is deposited a thin layer of coarse rough gravel, and on that, another layer of rich mold, which should be about 2 feet thick in the center of the bed, where the largest shrubs are to be planted, and shelving off to about 16 or 18 inches at the sides, next the walks. All the sashes should be made to open, and there should be large glass doors in front, that should be generally open during the day in summer, in order to admit as much air as possible. In some places, a movable frame is contrived for a conservatory, into which sashes lit in winter, and which, in severe weather, is covered with tarpaulin, contrived to pull down, like a blind, from a roller, along the ridge of the roof. The whole frame being so contrived as to be entirely removed in summer. The upright posts of this frame are let into holes in the ground, like the posts in a drying ground, so that, when the posts are taken out, the holes may be stopped up with wooden plugs with rings attached, and the roof and horizontal pieces lit into each other and into the uprights. The whole being kept firm by bolts. When a conservatory of this kind is to be removed for the summer, the side sashes and doors are taken away first, generally about the middle or end of April. A week or 10 days after, the sashes of the roof are taken off, but the frame and tarpaulin are left in case of spring frosts, and, when all danger from these is over, the whole of the framework is removed, and the orange trees, camellias, and other exotic trees that have been planted in the conservatory appear to be growing in the open air. The orangery is often contrived so as to be used as a kind of living room during summer, as it is only intended for the reception of the orange trees and other plants belonging to the genus Citrus during winter. The trees are generally grown in large tubs and boxes in a rich loamy soil, and are set out in the open air during summer, when they require but little care, provided they are frequently watered over the leaves, though they do not like much water, to their roots. When young plants are raised from seed, they seldom flower till they have been budded or grafted from an old tree. Orange trees are generally put in the open air in May and kept there till September or October, and they are very seldom shifted. They require scarcely any light or water during winter, and no heat beyond what is necessary to protect them from the frost. Some of the varieties of Camellia japonica are sufficiently hardy to grow in the open air in the neighborhood of London, provided their roots and the lower part of their stems are mulched, that is, covered with straw or litter, and the main trunk wrapped round with a hay band, a few inches from the ground. The hardiest kind is the variegated red. Camellias seldom do well in pots, except when they are very small, as, when they attain a tolerable size in pots, the flower buds are very apt to fall off without expanding. The best mode of growing camellias is, therefore, to plant them in the free soil of a conservatory, taking care that some creeping plant is trained along the rafters over their heads, as they do not like to be exposed to too much sun, unless they have also a great deal of air and are frequently and regularly watered. The soil for camellias should be peat, mixed with a little sandy loam. The temperature of the camellia house should be from 50 degrees to 60 degrees during the whole of the growing season, but, when the flower buds have formed, the glasses are generally taken off during the rest of the summer. Early in autumn, however, when the flower buds begin to swell, the glasses should be put on and the house kept warm, the plants being regularly watered morning and evening, as, if the watering be neglected a single day, or if stagnant water be suffered to remain about the roots, the flower buds will be sure to drop off, without expanding. Camellias do not require frequent repotting. Small camellias are generally shifted only once in 2 years, and large ones, that is, those above 5 feet high, not oftener than once in 3 or 4 years. The time for shifting camellias is just when they have done flowering, before they are beginning to send out their young shoots. Great care must be taken when they are repotted not to bruise the roots, as they are very easily injured. Both camellias and orange trees are very subject to the attacks of the black fly, a kind of aphis. The best way of destroying these insects is to syringe the plants well, laying them down on their sides when they are in pots, or, if they are planted in the free soil, syringing them with a garden engine, so as to throw the water in a powerful stream upwards, in order to get at the undersurface of the leaves, where the insects are generally found. Some persons recommend fumigating with tobacco smoke, but I have never found it so efficacious as syringing and washing the undersurface of the leaves with a sponge, in case the insects should be very numerous.